Thank you, everybody. Can everybody hear me in the back okay?
Yep.
All right. Well, first of all, it's an honor to be here, and I appreciate you having me. Let's get down to the nitty-gritty here. Why do you care about this presentation? The reason is because you care about animals, and you want to help them. I'm going to tell you today how to help as many of them as possible. I want to share some of my experience with you. Over the past decade, I've worked in a lot of different nonprofits that help animals. I spent time working in a shelter. I spent time managing multiple wildlife rehabilitation centers. I spent time as a humane investigator in Illinois. And I spent time working in farm animal advocacy groups. A couple years ago, I woke up one day after a particularly stressful week. And I asked myself, is this it? Am I doing as much as I possibly can? I'm putting in as unbelievable hours and effort to help animals. But am I really helping as many as I could be? Has anyone else had that question? Some hands. Has anyone else ever wondered which charities to support after you get about 100 different solicitations in the mail? And this presentation is for you. I challenge each of you to ask yourself the tough questions about what you do to help animals and how you can improve it. Today, we're going to talk about three things. First, there are many different causes to help animals. How do you decide which cause to focus your efforts? The second thing we'll talk about is once you've decided a cause to focus on, how do you decide what to do for that cause? And third, we're going to focus on which charities should you support. Let's start with the first point. What cause should I focus on? As you know, I'm the executive director of Animal Charity Evaluators. And our mission is to find and promote the most effective ways to help animals. In doing that, we would be doing a disservice to animals if we didn't consider the numbers. The numbers of animals being affected in our society. The numbers reflect this. Out of every 100 animals, land animals that are killed in the United States, 99 animals are killed for food. That means all the animals that are killed for testing and research or as a result of their use in entertainment or euthanasia at shelters, all those animals put together still only compose about 1%. Furthermore, if you look at this graph, we have on the left that 99% of the animals used by humans are farm animals. But underneath that, we have the percentage of donations to animal charities that go to farm animals. So that means despite having 99% of the animals afflicted, farm animal efforts only get 1% of the donations. Conversely, the opposite is true. Taking all the other animals into play, they add up to 99% of the donations. Now, this is a really important graphic, and I want to elaborate on it further with this one. Now, I don't have the specifics of what those colors mean right now because they're not important. There's one color that's important, and that's the green color, which on this presentation looks a little bit not very green. But if we look at the number of animals, again, 99 out of 100 are going to be farm animals. That's the green part of this. But if we take a look at the green part on the other side, the actual number of donations that are going to those farm animal charities, it's about 1%. This is a serious problem that we need to address in our own efforts. Let's talk about cost effectiveness for a second. Now, I told you at the beginning of this talk that I've had experience in a lot of different animal advocacy fields. I originally started off working in a shelter, and then I eventually went to wildlife and farm animal advocacy, hence the pictures here. If you look at how much it costs a shelter to adopt out a stray animal, it ends up costing between $250 and $300 per animal that they adopt out. Now, this doesn't seem so bad if you think about it. That's considering food for the animal, medicine, vaccines, veterinary care, mortgage for the shelter, staff time. That's considering a lot of things. So $250 to $300 is not so bad. In fact, if we had a choice, if we had an animal in front of us that was sick, that we could help. We had a dog in front of us that was sick, and we could help. And the price to help that animal was $250. If we had to make a choice between helping that animal live or buying the next Xbox, I think a lot of people would pick helping the animal. It makes sense. Now let's look at another area that help animals, wildlife rehabilitation. Now, we don't have as many numbers to support the data I'm going to give you because I'm just reflecting on my own experience. But in my own experience with wildlife rehabilitation, it ended up costing us about $30 per animal to release a healthy animal back into the wild. So that's $30 an animal versus $250 or $300. That's a pretty big difference. And if you value wild animal lives in a similar way that you value companion animal lives, then perhaps it's time to think about supporting that cause a little bit more. But wait, then there's farm animal advocacy. Using research on leafleting as an intervention to help farm animals, our best guess for farm animals is that it costs about $11 to save a little over 50 animals from a lifetime of misery. However, I want to be clear, we're uncertain with that number. And there's a lot that we don't know because handing out booklets isn't the same as directly helping animals like in a shelter. But to put this into perspective, let's say we were off by a factor of 20. Let's say we were wrong by a factor of 20. And that $11 contribution only helps 2.5 animals. Even giving our estimates being off by a factor of 20, it still costs about $4 to help a farm animal versus $30 for a wild animal and versus $200 to $300 for shelters. This is a big difference. And the reason that a lot of us don't know about it is because there's a disconnect in society between farm animals and companion animals and humans. I'm going to talk about that disconnect more in a minute. Another reason we believe farm animal advocacy has the highest potential to help animals is the law. Or, to be more specific, the lack thereof. The law. There are 2 federal guidelines to help animals, 2 federal acts. One is called the Animal Welfare Act. It's great in that it helps prevent abuse and neglect for a great deal of animals. The problem with the Animal Welfare Act is it has language that says excludes farm animals. So the Animal Welfare Act, which is in place to protect animals, actually is ignoring the greatest percentage of them that are out there suffering. There's one piece of federal legislation on the books that does apply to farm animals, and that's the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act. Unfortunately, there's another big complication with that act, because that act excludes birds. birds account for 95% of the farm animals that we raise on land and kill for food. So this means there are no federal laws for 95% of the animals raised and killed for food. This is also really, really important for us to think about. So factoring in the incredibly high number of farm animals, the incredibly low number of donations, and the non-existent laws to help farm animals, we believe that farm animal advocacy has the greatest potential for you to have the highest impact. Now, a question we always get when we talk about these things is what's wrong with helping them? They're animals in need, right? While I don't, in fact, think there's anything wrong with helping those animals, I'm going to answer the question of why we should be asking ourselves questions like that. You see, here's the problem. The animal shelter is a couple blocks away. You've adopted your cat from them. You know someone on the board. You know the staff. You know the animals. You know dogs and cats. You've been around them your entire life. It's easy to make a connection to those animals and to see the need that they have. You know how to care for a dog. You know how to care for a cat. You've grown up with them. So if you want to help animals, doesn't it make perfect sense that you would go there and help them at the shelter? To go work with animals that you know and understand and that are in your community? Conversely, you do know about some other opportunities to help animals. You do know that there is animals suffering in farms, and you do know that there are animals that are orphaned in the wild, and you do know that there are animals used for research that need help. But you don't have any experience with those animals. You have no knowledge of them, or very little. We no longer have farms in our neighborhoods. Farms are tucked away where we can't see them anymore. You haven't ever cared for any of these animals directly, and if you wanted to talk about how you were going to help them, you wouldn't know the first place to start. So the answer to this question is nothing. There's absolutely nothing wrong with helping those animals. They need help. They need help just as much as those animals being used for research and entertainment and our farms. Some of the people I admire and respect most in my entire life dedicate their lives to these causes. And I think they've had a real impact on the animals they've interacted with. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be asking ourselves this question, and that we shouldn't consider redistributing some of our efforts. Even if it's only a few hours a week where you help out a farm animal charity instead of helping out your local shelter, you can exponentially make a bigger impact over your life by making those choices. The same goes for your donations. Again, that shelter is a couple blocks away. You know everyone there. You see the result of the money that you just spent on a donation. You see the physical result of the animals being helped. So you see it firsthand. You support them financially. There's nothing wrong with that. However, based on what I've just talked about, I think you would agree it seems sensible that we should shift some of our donations, if not all, but some of our donations to effective charities, and in particular to farm animal charities. I'm going to talk about that later this talk. And if you don't know which groups to contact about this, we've got you covered. Animal Charity Evaluators exists for this reason. We rate animal charities based on their impact. We've done the hard work so you don't have to. Our advice on charities on what you can personally do to help animals is based on the concept of effective altruism. This essentially means trying to help as many as possible. Think of it as an equation. How can you take your time and your money to equal the greatest possible good. And that is effective altruism. And based on the principles of effective altruism, we believe farm animal advocacy is the area where you can have the highest impact. The next section I'm going to talk about is what should you do for the cause. It's important not only to consider what field, what area you want to assist animals in, but specifically what should you be doing for them. Now, we have lots of great career and volunteer advice on our site. I'm going to talk about some of that later in this talk. But first, I want to tell you a little bit of a story about myself. Growing up, I was all about sports. I threw everything I could into them. I was the kid in 5th grade who, when the basketball was rolling towards the sideline, I would run full speed and dive into the bleachers to save it. And that would be during our first practice of the season. I always have been giving 110% my entire life. I like to compete. I like to win. And for that reason, my school even gave me the only award that they give out for sports, the most inspirational. But let me tell you, most inspirational does not equal most effective. I took my mentality of giving it 110% in wanting to win to advocacy. I spent countless hours. I engaged in so many different ways to help animals, I've lost track. These are all me, but I've got about 100 other pictures of completely different activities I could have put up here. But there's pictures of me advocating against the use of animals in laboratories, evidence of me at a shelter, feeding animals at the wildlife center, handing out leaflets, doing free food demonstrations, giving classroom presentations. I did everything I possibly could think of to do. In a 2-year period, I did about 120 events in addition to 2 other jobs that I had. Near the end of that 2 years, I started asking myself that question I brought up at the beginning of the talk. I was feeling pretty burned out. And I'm sure a lot of you get that feeling too. Because helping animals is tough work. It's unrelenting work. The suffering never stops. Their need never stops. And our desire to help them never stops. I didn't know the things that I'm here to tell you today, so I'm hoping that you can take away some of the lessons I've learned over the last 10 years to make yourself be more effective in the work that you do. So with that in mind, let's take a look at some more specific examples of things you can do to help animals, farm animals. A very popular way to help farm animals is leafleting. This is a technique where you go to a college campus often or a busy street corner and simply pass out brochures about the cruelty in factory farms. Now, I mentioned to you earlier we have a little research on it, but we need more. But the reason that we really like leafleting here at Animal Charity Evaluators is because it's incredibly easy and it's incredibly cheap. You can get 100 booklets from a charity that produces them for you for $11. You could take your lunch break at work and walk over to the college campus and pass out those 100 leaflets and come back to work and have made a real difference. It's incredibly cheap and it's incredibly easy to do. Another way you can help farm animals is humane education, giving programs like this or in college classrooms. I do this myself. It's a great way to speak to a large audience. We're actually doing a study on this now. Another thing you can do to help farm animals is something called pay-per-view. This is a form of video outreach where you actually pay viewers $1 to watch a 4-minute video on factory farms. You set up little stations. These are little tablet stations set up by Mercy for Animals. And everyone gets headphones, and they're exposed to how farm animals are treated. You can do peaceful demonstrations like this from animal equality in Spain. where you acknowledge the existence and value of those animals in a demonstration. You can protest specific grievances. Mercy for Animals has been protesting Walmart's purchasing of pork from people from farms that still use gestation crates. So in this one, they have a bunch of protesters with signs, and they have a giant inflatable pig behind them. But essentially, you're trying to convince a company to do something differently. There are things like sponsored walks, where you can march in a parade or through your streets, the proper permits, of course, and advertise your message and get people to sponsor you. There are food demonstrations where you provide free vegan food for the public so they can try vegan meats and realize that they're actually quite good. You can have shelters where you take in individual animals that need assistance. While we do recognize that there's a powerful component in shelters that's valuable to society and that they show us farm animals in a natural setting and let them live out their lives, we generally don't advocate for shelters as much because there's a high cost per individual animals. Most shelters spend a lot of resources on the individual animals in their care. So because of that, we tend to gravitate towards educational approaches. And there's things like online advertising. There are groups that use commercials on Hulu. There are groups that do Facebook advertising where you put an ad up on Facebook, get people to click on it, and for 20 cents you can get them to a website about your concern. So these are all different ways, and of course there's many other ways you can help farm animals. But how do you know which one is effective? The answer? We don't know. What we can do is take educated guesses and use the evidence we do have to reach conclusions about which intervention we should support. Along that line, right now we recommend refilling, again, because it's incredibly simple to do and it's cost effective. Now, regardless of which approach you take to helping animals, it's important to consider a lot of little factors when you're speaking to the public about how farm animals are treated. Consider this chart from Nick Cooney's Veganomics. This shows the percent of days of suffering spared by adopting each diet. Of course, if you're eating a vegan diet, you're not harming any animals in your purchases, so it's 100%. If you look at vegan except dairy, you're still very, very high. And if you look at vegetarian, you're still preventing 89%. If you simply avoid fish and poultry, you're preventing 84%. Well, what about that red meat? You're only preventing 4% with red meat by not eating red meat. See, here's the problem. A lot of groups do advocate for vegetarianism because of health. Now, without going into whether or not we support the health argument, because that's a longer discussion, I do want to say that a result of using the health argument is that people give up red meat. After all, everybody knows in society that red meat is particularly bad for you of all the meats that are out there. The doctors tell you reduce your red meat intake, and someone who wants to help animals and wants to help themselves are logically going to pick red meat. Because, I'm giving up red meat, I'm giving up an animal product, I'm doing good for the animals, and I'm doing good for me. But the problem is that not only by taking out only red meat are you only helping that small percentage, but actually you're increasing the suffering of animals. Because the vast majority of the people who give up red meat are going to replace it with chicken or with fish. It takes many, many more chickens to compose the same amount of animal flesh as a cow. So by giving up red meat and replacing that with chicken and fish, you end up harming a lot of additional animals. Now, all of these points up here should be considered when you're speaking to the public about farm animal advocacy. You see, sometimes you're going to speak to someone who doesn't want anything to do with vegetarianism or meat reduction or veganism, and you're not going to convince that person to go vegan. So it's helpful to know that, well, maybe if I can just convince those people to give up fish, and maybe if I can just convince those people to give up chicken, they'll actually be doing a great service for animals without even being vegetarian. So it's important to know things like this when you're advocating for farm animals. Another consideration is what type of approach to use. We believe in the foot in the door approach, which essentially says that if you ask for something small now and they agree to it, they're much more likely to comply with a larger ask later on. So get your foot in the door. There are many studies out there that support this. There's also an alternative tactic called door in the face that people will certainly bring up with me after this, but we tend to think that foot in the door is a better approach. Hence programs like Meatless Mondays. For people who aren't ready to make that commitment, but who are interested, that's a way to get them involved in talking about the issues. In fact, foot in the door is how I got to where I am today. Foot in the door is how I decided to focus on animals and how I decided to dedicate my life to helping them. I actually received this flyer on a college campus my senior year 11 years ago. You probably can't read it, so I'm going to read it for you. Even if you like meat, you can help end this cruelty. By just cutting your meat intake in half, you can spare hundreds of animals from a lifetime of suffering. I saw this walking by on a college campus, and I was struck. Because no one had ever come to me with that approach before. It was always, you're either a vegetarian or a vegan, and you're good, or you're an asshole. I mean, let's be honest, how often have we heard that from groups? In one way or another. But here was this group that was saying, we know you care about animals. We know you know this is wrong. Let's take a step in the right direction. Why don't you try to cut half of your meat out? I didn't know any vegetarians. I didn't know any vegans. I don't know how that happened going through college, but it just did. And I went vegetarian very soon after getting that flyer. I spent about 4 weeks cutting my consumption in half and just reducing. And I said, that was so simple. Why am I not just cutting it all out? So it was a stepping stone. It was a foot in the door. Another thing to consider is, what's the maximal impact that you as an individual can have on farm animals? So, one single person can spare about 28 chickens a year from suffering by not eating chicken for that year. The average American eats 28 chickens a year. This chart is thankfully a little out of date because it shows 35, and the consumption of animal products has been decreasing the past couple of years. But if you think about what you could do if you convince other people to get out there and help farm animals, now we're talking. Now we're talking about real change. Because if you just sit at home and you have a personally pure vegan diet, that's great. But that's not going to change the world. This is what's going to change the world. And if we're serious about helping as many animals as possible, we need to consider this. So I'm going to talk about one more thing before we go on to which charities we should support. There's this issue called replaceability. Let's use a real-life example to illustrate this principle. So let's say this woman's name is Susie, and she's studying to become a veterinarian. She's going to vet school. It's extremely competitive. She's not the top of her class, but she's doing pretty well. She's very close to becoming a veterinarian. But let's think about it for a second. If here's the stack of candidates at the school, at the veterinary school, and Susie's somewhere up here. Let's say we just slip her out of the equation. Just pretend she doesn't exist. What happens? Nothing happens. What happens is the people below her in quality slightly move up. So that means that the job that she would have taken after graduating, the person who is just a hair less good at the job than her will get that job. And thus, the impact for animals will not be greatly reduced. In that scenario, Susie is highly replaceable. Now, I'm not saying that anyone that goes to be a veterinarian is highly replaceable, so I'll get back to that in a second. Just stay with me here. Let's think about someone who goes into finance or a high-paying career, and they earn 6 figures soon out of college. Okay, so let's do the same scale. You've got a stack of candidates, right? And that person's somewhere down here, not the top, but not the bottom, not the middle, a little bit above. You pull them out of the mix, and someone else just steps up to take their place, just like Susie, right? However, if that person planned on donating a big percentage of their income to charities, then all of a sudden, that person is not highly replaceable anymore. They have very low replaceability. Because the person that's going to take his place if he didn't exist is not going to be donating a lot of money, especially not to an effective charity. Or the odds of that are very low. Now, Susie could also lower her replaceability if she chooses to donate a lot of her income from being a veterinarian to farm animal or effective animal charities. There's another area where you can also have low replaceability. Consider the job that I do. Consider the job that Michael Nielsen does here for Mercy for Animals, who's going to speak to you in just a short while here. Nonprofit jobs are incredibly demanding. They're incredibly work-intensive. They have low pay. So your pool of qualified candidates for positions like that is not going to be as great. That means if you took me out of the equation, you're not necessarily going to find someone who's approximately the same quality. If you take Michael out of the equation, you're not necessarily going to find someone that's the same quality. There might be a more noticeable dip. And so in that way, you can lower your replaceability by carefully choosing where you work as well. This is just something that we should all think about, especially those who are aspiring to start careers. Lastly, I want to talk about which charities should I support. We don't just provide advice for animal advocates, we also provide recommendations. Before I tell you which charities we think you should support, I'm going to tell you how we arrived at our conclusions. We looked at 7 criteria. We looked at 100 animal charities in the United States, and we evaluated them based on this 7 criteria. The first is room for more funding. It is important that the organization shows that they have a need for more money and that they have a plan for how they're going to use it. Second, we want to know that back of the envelope calculation finds the organization as cost effective. This involves making estimates based on the numbers we do know about how effective those tactics we talked about are and applying them to the groups that use them. We also want to make sure that the organization is working on things that seem to have high mission effectiveness. That means that they're working on farm animal causes, as we discussed earlier, and that they have tactics that we agree are high impact. And this is really important. This was a really important criteria for our latest round of recommendations, and that's that the organization possesses a robust understanding of success and failure. Oops, I misspelled success. So, we want to make sure that charities that we review are failing and that they're learning. Because if they're not failing and they're not learning, then they're not innovating. They're not evaluating. They're not testing. And we think those things are crucial right now. It's so important that organizations display an understanding of why something's not working. If they don't understand it, that they launch an investigation to understand it, and then take steps to fix the problem and try different interventions. It's also important that the organization possesses a strong track record of success, that they have strong leadership and structure, that they have low turnover in their key leadership positions, and that they have a plan and a structure in place for bringing in new volunteers and employees. And finally, that the organization is transparent, which means that they are open about their findings, about the things that they found that worked, and the things that they found that didn't work. Based on these 7 criteria, we're proud to announce Mercy for Animals and the Humane League as our top charities. Again, based out of 100 animal charities in the United States, we found that Mercy for Animals and the Humane League performed exceptionally well on each of those 7 criteria. Both are involved with education and outreach for farm animals. Mercy for Animals works on undercover investigations, which we believe have great value to a lot of organizations. And the Humane League does something that's unique as well, in that they have a program that tests the effectiveness of different materials. So these are both groups that are doing innovative, strong, quality work to help animals. And we recommend donating to these 2 groups. I do want to acknowledge we do have 2 standout charities. They are more or less our runners-up to the top charities. So they performed very highly, but for one reason or another, we decided they weren't going to be our top charities. Those 2 groups are the Farm Animal Rights Movement and the Farm Animal Protection Campaign of the Humane Society in the United States. Again, those are both very strong charities. We have full detailed reports about all of these charities online. But in the end, our top selections are still Mercy for Animals and the Humane League. I didn't mention this as one of the points I would cover today, but the last thing I'm going to discuss is who can help me decide what to do. I mean, I've just thrown a lot of information at you, and I can't expect that you walk out the door knowing exactly what you're going to do. That being said, the decision here is up to you. It's up to you to decide how to spend your time and money through volunteering and donating. It's up to you to decide how effective you want to be with these resources. You know now what I've shown you today. You know that farm animals are in the greatest need of help. You know that they get the least amount of money out there. So you have the power to decide what you do. Please don't forget about this talk when you leave this room. This is an incredibly important topic. You can help exponentially more animals through your life by thinking about these things and acting accordingly. Don't miss the opportunity to be more effective and to help as many animals as possible. Thank you for having me here today. After this talk, I want to say that I will be at the table for Animal Charity Evaluators in the exhibit hall. Please come visit me if you have any questions that we're not able to cover here. And please come visit our website, animalcharityevaluators.org, to learn lots of more great information about how you can maximize your impact in helping animals. Thank you.